Welcome viewers to this series of lectures on European history. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at Hindu College, University of Delhi, and the topic that we are discussing today is the rise of absolutist states in Europe. I have spoken to you about this particular topic earlier, and this can be seen as in continuation to whatever we discussed with reference to its backdrop, with reference to its nature. So today we shall be talking about the timeline of absolutism, the critiques with reference to its timeline, and also the critique of the generally accepted nature of absolutist states. As you can see on your slide, generally accepted timeline of absolutism is 1660 to 1789, as the dates itself would reveal. 1660 is the date of the accession of Louis XIV, the King of France, and he's regarded as a monarch who actually exemplified in classical sense of the term as to what an absolutist state was all about. And he's known in history for having said, "I am the state," and that gave a very you can say popular image of what an absolutist state in Europe was all about. And we in today's discussion would try and evaluate to what extent we can agree with that assertion, with the timing of the generally accepted timeline, or the timeline, the acceptance of the timeline, that is 1660 to 1789. 1789, as you would know, is the point where French Revolution began. So that marks the end of absolutist states and emergence of republicanism in France and in other parts of Europe as well. However, this characterization of absolutist state or its emergence from 1660 to 1789 in Europe can be regarded as genuine only if absolutism is defined as the conscious extension of the legal and administrative power of the state sovereigns over their subjects and over the vested interests of the social and economic order in which those subjects were ranked. We all know that in the pre-modern times, pre-French Revolution times, European society was divided into three states. So you have the clergy, the nobility, and the third state. And whatever legislation, taxation, or deliberations happened, they happened with respect to a particular state, and that was how it operated. And if you are thinking of emergence of an absolutist state, well, that has to transact across these states. Now, to what extent it could do that? It could consciously extend its power in a legal and administrative sense across these states, across these vested social interests, is something that is not usually agreed universally by all the historians, and that's where question marks are raised, that absolutist states cannot or could not be regarded as absolutist in literal sense of the term, and that's where the debate lies. So the dates of 1660 to 1789 as the date of or as the period of absolutist states in Europe, and even use of this label absolutism, need a fair bit of caution. We must exercise breaks when we use these umbrella terms for such a large canvas of time. And this particular term, which means or which gives this impression that all levers of power emerges or is in the hands of the monarch, and that is what absolutist states are all about. Perhaps that was not the case, and that is what we will argue. So, why we are saying that it is a little bit problematic to agree with this timeline of 1660 to 1789, which is the usually traditionally agreed upon timeline for absolutist states, is because there is a long preface of trend towards omnicompetence in England and even elsewhere from 1500 onwards. And that tells us that 100, 200, 150 years had elapsed before the supposed beginning of absolutist states as a trend. And those 150 years or 200 years, England and other parts of Europe were already experiencing some kind of a preface, some kind of a you can say groundwork being done with reference to the power and administrative presence of the state system, which earlier was not so obvious and not so powerful. So that is what we mean here. And when we are talking of those 1 century or more than a century period of 16th century in Europe, basically we are hinting at the times of Protestantism during the larger part of 16th century Europe, which had been used as some kind of a means to assert sovereignty of a state as a challenge to the papal and aristocratic power. So, since we know Protestantism emerging against the corrupt practices of the Catholic Church or the papal authority, therefore, Protestantism, well, on the face of it, is a religious movement, all right, to cleanse Christianity of several ills and corrupt practices, but simultaneously there is some kind of an assertion of an agency outside church for managing the mundane affairs of Europeans, and that is what the new political sovereign would be, and that is what earns the epithet in future as the absolutist state. And obviously it is fighting against the papal authority and also the aristocratic multiple loci of power which characterized political transactions of power in the times before. So what I mean here is that a fair groundwork had already been done in Europe much before the emergence of absolutism in terms of strengthening or in terms of earning sovereignty for the maintained power or for political authorities. Now, we also have several political thinkers, the most noticeable being Bodin, who had championed the cause of absolutism much before the coming of Louis XIV, with whom we generally tend to regard the beginning of absolutism. So, Bodin, for example, had been talking of the need, or he had been giving justification, political justification for the necessity, for the need to have a political agency outside church that could exercise power in secular domain of human transactions. And therefore, traditional writings that attribute the rise of absolutism to individual efforts of various kings like Louis XIV and so forth. There were several other kings in different monarchies in different parts of Europe. But we have varieties of centralized governments instituted by the rulers of Prussia, Russia, even Austria, for that matter in England, these efforts, it gave rise to some kind of an oligarchy, where the political power was shared by not only the monarch but also the aristocracy after 1688. So what we are talking about is not some kind of a monolithic kind of state existing in all parts of Europe. So when we say absolutist states, we must be mindful of the fact that there already was a trend towards emergence of centralized governments that had been happening all across 16th century in different parts of Europe, say Prussia, Russia, Austria, England included, and they had thrown different variants of centralized governments, and it's not easy to club them all together under one kind of rubric called the absolutist state, which is generally characterized by what the state looked like under Louis XIV in France. So there is fair degree of variation that we must be mindful of. So absolutism is actually not equal to despotism. When we say despotism, or in fact when we say absolutism resulting from the individual efforts of the king, generally the understanding goes that whatever the king wanted, or as I just mentioned that Louis XIV is said to have said, I am the state. That means whatever he wants becomes law, whatever he wants he gets done, and that is how powerful the state was during his time. But fact of the matter is a little bit different, that if you really look at the varieties of centralized governments that we get in Europe, across 17th century or even 18th century, we find that there are a lot of constraints within which the absolutist monarchies had to operate, and therefore it wasn't as if the personal whims and fancies of the king could be carried through as law across Europe. In fact, arbitrariness of law is not something that can be associated with absolutist state. So it's not a despotic state the way in dominant historiography you have the Asiatic societies being represented as despotic states, right? So it's not of that kind. It's different, it's more nuanced, and it's more constrained. So the kings, despite efforts to consolidate authority, couldn't issue irresponsible decrees and achieve some kind of a lasting compliance of it. So there were several norms, there were several you can say speed breakers, there were several structural limits, there were several social groups that cut into the power and laws made by the absolutist monarchies, and the absolutist monarch had to contend with it, and that tells us that it couldn't afford to be very arbitrary as very casually one can presume it to be. So as a student of history, we need to guard against such kind of a general portrayal of absolutist monarchies as such. So there is a constraining presence of aristocracy, churchmen, merchant bodies and merchants, entrepreneurs, the bourgeoisie. There were several law processes sanctified by customs prevailing in a particular area, and also, last but not the least, the rudimentary nature of transportation and communication itself. So as we tend to presume in the present times that the king's decree could have been carried across his empire seamlessly, as if all the transportation and communication facilities were there. That's not the right way to understand any particular period in history. We must understand what could have been the fastest mode of transportation and communication in 16th and 17th century Europe. And when you visualize that, you find that well, there were several technological limitations to the furtherance of political sovereignty of the state in Europe even in 17th century, and one needs to be mindful of that. So what we have just hinted at is the constraining factors to the arbitrary exercise of sovereignty by the state, even if they were supposedly absolutist, so to say. And despite all these constraints that we just spoke of, we should not lose sight of the other dimension of the reality of 17th century Europe as well. There was some kind of an appeal, and there was some kind of a justification of absolutism as well in the air in the times. Most of these justifications and a major segment of this appeal or charm for absolutism or need for absolutism came from reasons that are similarly cited for the emergence of mercantilism also. So it is you can say a theory of contrast, that there is so much of chaos, there is so much of normlessness, everyone for everything kind of a situation in the preceding period, and to circumvent it, to get over it, to modify it, you need a strong agency, political agency, that can bring order to it, that can regulate it, that can administer it better. And therefore, in economic terms, or in terms of economic policy, it is mercantilism, and the political spin-off of that is absolutist state. So state can intervene in this normlessness only if it is powerful. So in theory and in practice, this need or this appeal or this justification was expressed in a desire to end the constant alarms and confusion that prevailed in Europe in the form of, say, in France, the religious wars, or the 30 Years' War in Germany, or in England, the civil wars. So in this backdrop, you had this kind of a appeal getting generated for the coming of an absolutist monarchical situation. So that aspect is also there. So there is some kind of a dilemma that is there even at the popular and social level. So it is the contrast of the alternative that is at play at this point of time in 17th century Europe. On the one hand, you have the feudal confusing times of internecine wars and confusion. On the other hand, you have a desire for a regulated society by an agency, that is a sovereign political agency called the state, and one has to imbue it with a lot of power, and that's the only way out. And so there is that kind of thing going in the air in Europe in 17th century. So some kind of a domestic order through strong centralized governments is what is being desired at this point of time, and that's also a reality which several historians offer as some kind of a justification, ideological justification for emergence of the absolutist monarchies. So it was believed that the social and political harmony could be realized only when the subjects recognized, subjects means the common people who erstwhile were the subjects of a monarch or a particular dynasty and so forth. So unless these subjects recognized their duty to obey the divinely sanctioned rulers. So this is this realization that you can say gives a kind of social scaffolding or some kind of a social justification for the emergence of the absolutist monarchies across regions in Europe. So in order to achieve these objectives of creating some kind of a political harmony and order in confusing preceding periods, the monarchs attempted to control the following. Number one, it displayed some kind of a disposition of the state's armed forces. So the armed forces, state's armed forces, needed to be controlled and regulated and directly administered by the monarch or the monarchy. So disposition of state's armed forces is one attribute or is one attempt that the monarchies are making, and that is how emergence of absolutism is articulated in these times. And when you think of states' armed forces, you should keep in mind that the earlier practice was that the aristocracy used to maintain their own private armies, and that had to be disbanded. That had to be disbanded, and that power had to be taken away from the aristocracy, and there is some kind of a monopolization of the state so far as maintaining army is concerned, and that is something that is being attempted by these absolutist monarchs across regions in Europe in 17th century and in 18th century. Similarly, administration of its legal system. So as I said earlier, that the aristocrats in the feudal times also had several legal jurisdictions over the people under them, and that had to be taken away. Again, the legal authority had to be also monopolized by the state, and more legal provisions were actually taken away from the aristocracy, and they were all vested with the political sovereign that we know as absolutist monarchies. So there is an attempt by the state to get into the administration of its legal system as well, and that changed or that leveraged a lot of power and authority to the state as well. Collection and distribution of its tax revenues, that's very obvious, be it say Western Europe or even in Eastern Europe, although in Eastern Europe there is fair degree of laxity that is there, and more and more opportunity is being granted to the existing feudal lords to continue taxing the peasantry, and that's why in Eastern Europe it is leading to intensification of serfdom, whereas in Western Europe it is working to the contrary. The state is monopolizing tax distribution and collection more and more. So in these attempts of doing the following that I just listed, there is some kind of attempt at the behest of the state to go for more and more bureaucratization, monopolization of force, creation of legitimacy, and that's how divine theories of kingship emerge in Europe. Homogenization of the subject population, so doing away with the state system, rather regarding them as homogeneous population under a particular monarch. These are very progressive things which actually happened, or they were actualized as a consequence of events towards the last quarter of 18th century through French Revolution and so forth. It would be rather premature to visualize all these things happening during absolutist monarchies. Nevertheless, there was an attempt on part of the absolutist monarchies to go for such changes, and that is how these absolutist monarchies are imbued with these progressive roles also that they played. And in this process, they of course had the obstacles in the form of church and nobility that they were fighting against, or at times they were negotiating with them also for more and more authority. Semi-autonomous regions over which they had to now increasingly exercise their political control and sovereignty, and the would-be independent representative bodies like Parliament in England and States Generals or États Généraux in France. So these are popular representative bodies that existed in the history of these countries. And if absolutist state had to survive, they had to pierce through this, and they had to make their sovereignty feel, or they had to make their sovereignty felt by piercing through these agencies that represented some kind of a popular control, some kind of a representative politics. So that is how these obstacles were seen and negotiated with. So in our lecture today, we have spoken of what the desire and efforts of the absolutist monarchs were. At the same time, we have listed the obstacles that were there, and as a consequence of the negotiation with both, different kinds of political systems emerged, by and large with more element of political sovereignty under their command, and that is how the nature and feature of the absolutist states across regions in Europe in 17th and 18th century needs to be understood. Thank you.